So hello everyone and welcome to Greg Iwanu's webinar, Finding Work, Tips for Students and New Editors. Greg has been working in publishing for more than 40 years and it feels that he's still just starting to explore the industry's potential. He was Editors Canada's first membership chair and sold himself the very first membership in the association. He launched Colburn Communications, a writing and editing company in 1985, Iguana Books, a hybrid publisher and packager in 1992, and Pub Launch, which serves self-publishing authors soon-ish. He's worked on everything from a love letter to Burger King giveaways to board games, and from a provincial budget to a Margaret Atwood novel. And today he will be putting all of that experience at your disposal by presenting a webinar with some very useful tips for how people just breaking into the business can get ahead. So welcome, Greg.
Thanks. Looking forward to seeing how this turns out. So it logically makes very little sense to have someone doing this who's been editing for 43 years. Like, I'm presuming most of the participants weren't born in 1977 when I started. And the world has changed so much, particularly the editing world, that an awful lot of my experience doesn't apply. But an amazing amount of it still does. And I've spent a lot of the last 40 years hiring editors. So I sort of know the other side of the transaction, what people who are looking for a beginning editor are looking for. So let's see how much of that still applies. So first thing that's changed enormously is the publishing industry, the book publishing industry. When I first started, there were something like 90 major publishers in Toronto and many, many more scattered across the country. And now there are fewer than 10. And even with that kind of contraction, the amount of work they're farming out has also shrunk. So the traditional pool, particularly for book editors, has shrunk enormously. One of my first strategies when I started out was get the yellow pages and phone through the book publishers. And so for quite a while, my work was from Addison Wesley, Collier Macmillan, Doubleday, the publishers at the top end of the alphabet as I phoned my way through the publishers. One day, I randomly decided to start phoning from the other end and got some work from Wiley. So I got the top of the alphabet and the bottom of the alphabet. And the Macmillans and so on took much longer to find me. That isn't possible anymore. The traditional book publishers are swamped with people who want to work for them, and they are probably the absolute worst place to start looking for work. Second thing that's changed is editorial training. In 1977, the Centennial College Publishing Program had just started, although as a beginning would-be editor, I hadn't heard of it. Ryerson and George Brown and Simon Fraser and all the others were in the future. So it was pretty much, and there wasn't an editors association. It was pretty much impossible to get any kind of formal editorial training. So got myself a copy of the Chicago Manual of Style, the 12th edition, the first one in orange. My mother gave me Modern English Usage, which I read from cover to cover. I bought a couple of dictionaries and basically self-taught and pretended. Most of the other editors out there were the same. There was one publishing program in Stanford, and that was it. We were all self-taught. So that part of getting started is a whole lot easier than it used to be. Particularly since one of your main resources in finding work is the people you learn with. Beginning editors typically constantly trade each other work. Something will come into one editor, they're not the right person for it, so you should call Fergie, he does that. You need to be trained is the first thing any would-be employer is going to look for, and you need to use that training background as a networking opportunity. Most of the book publishers I know of If they want a beginning editor or an intern, they call someone at the local editing program and ask for, a list of your A+ students, please. It's mostly, that door is mostly by invitation, but there are many other doors you can knock on. When I was starting, you had to get a proofreading pencil, red one end, blue at the other. And it was nice to have a ruler. You had to have Post-it notes, although they actually weren't around in 1977 either. There were things called pink slips, which you had to lick and stick. It was all done on paper. As part of my master's degree, I actually had to use the mainframe computer for my thesis. So I was one of the very, very few editors who was comfortable on computers, which in the 70s and early 80s was a huge advantage for me. Less so now, you can simply assume that. But there wasn't having to learn the software and so on. One of the things I've done as much as I can for 40-ish years is keep on top of the software, keep on top of the tools, try and play with tools before other people have played with them. So I've been looking into things like, is artificial intelligence actually of use in editing? In what ways can you customize some of the software? How many ways can you actually use perfected that it wasn't intended to be used for? That sort of thing. The more you play with the tools, the more comfortable you are with them, the more skills you'll have to sell. And the other thing that's massively changed is the number of editors. I don't know how many editors there were in Canada or Toronto when I started, but there sure didn't seem to be a whole lot of us. And when you called someone saying you were an editor, it wasn't at all unusual to find that they had been looking for one, didn't know where to look for them. There was no internet, there was no editors association. It is a much, much, much more competitive world out there. You're competing against an awful lot of people who have an awful lot of training. But there are many, many, many more customers than there used to be. And the tools available to reach them are really powerful. So one of the main areas of work that didn't exist when I was starting out or didn't exist in any significant amount was self-publishing authors. Last year, there were 100,000 self-published books published in Canada and over 1 million in the States. This year, I would guess the number is double that. The amount of self-publishing work available is insane. As with the pandemic, every novelist out there or every would-be writer is dusting off the novel they never finished, getting it finished and submitting it or trying to find an editor for it. There's lots of competition, but there's lots and lots of opportunity. What hasn't really changed is the strategies that work. The main strategy that has worked for me all my life is look for work where other people aren't looking. So when I was starting out, I was living at York University with my wife, who was a grad student. And the first big freelance editing gig I won was advertised in the student newspaper at York. They have a little classified section. In that classified section, there was a publisher advertised for freelance editors. And not surprisingly, I was the only person who responded to the ad. That resulted in about two years worth of book editing work. The best cold call I've ever made was to a little design company that had opened up across the street from my apartment. Spencer, Francie, two guys, Spencer and Francie. Literally knocked on their door one day, asked if they had any editing or proofreading, and the answer was, "Are you busy today?" And they immediately sat me down to proofread some annual reports. They eventually grew. They landed Ontario Hydro as a customer, then Four Seasons Hotels. And as their go-to editor, I also found myself working for Ontario Hydro and Four Seasons. And That link to Four Seasons has now gone on since the mid-1980s, and basically most years pays about 20 to 40% of my income year after year after year from knocking on one door, a small design company. That, again, I was the only editor who thought of approaching them. So the main strategy is let everyone else knock on the door at Random House. They're not going to say yes anyway. Try and find doors other people aren't knocking on. Why do people hire editors? The answer to that would seem fairly obvious, but it's not. Some processes simply have editing built into them. If you're working on a magazine, if you're working on books, they know where they need editors, when they need editors, and so on. But there's much more work working on websites. There's much more work working on self-published books, corporate documents, government reports, and so on. And there, people's motivation for hiring editors is really different. A lot of the motivation is make me look good, make this report more effective, make it at least well enough written that people aren't going to laugh at me, get rid of the typos, get rid of the repetition. And a lot of the work as an editor is simply making things less embarrassing, making them more effective. That leads you really quickly into plain language work and so on. But a lot of editorial work, you're trying to get into the mind of the would-be customer and seeing what they can benefit from your work, how they can benefit from your work. A project a couple of years ago, we were editing some training materials for the auto industry, car repair documents. And it was really striking very early in the piece that some of the material was better written than other parts. And so we just started Googling some distinctive phrases and discovering that the writer they had hired had cut and pasted and copied huge chunks of it. And that if it was published the way that they intended to publish it, they were going to probably get their sock suit off. So it then became a project of checking to see what was copied, finding the plagiarized material, and getting rid of it. Either rewriting the material, writing replacement material, seeing how it could be restructured outside of that, and so on. That customer, the main benefit from hiring an editor was the documents he published were actually legal. There are all sorts of reasons people hire editors, and you want to be the solution as much as you possibly can. What are those people looking for? In most cases, they're looking to have their document edited for about the price of a hamburger. And you end up explaining, well, that's going to take me 50 hours. I need to make $40 an hour to be able to pay the rent and so on. So no, it's not going to be, it's going to be $2,000, not $5. And they point you at sites like Fiverr and so on. And the answer to that always is, okay, go use an editor from Fiverr and I'll talk to you in a couple of days. People, most of the public are looking to get work done as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible, and often their expectations are unrealistic. Or they're looking for something really specific. So a lot of your work as a freelancer particularly is sales, but also weeding people out, giving them a reality check. So if someone comes to me to prepare a book for publication, I'll often start the conversation really early in the piece with, you're probably looking at about $5,000 to $7,000. And they don't actually hang up in my ear, but that changes the conversation and abruptly ends some conversation. Okay, sorry, I can't afford that, bye. And you don't want to waste hours of your time on those conversations. You can transform it into, okay, what's your budget? And I'll tell you what I can do within that budget. But there are an awful lot of people out there with utterly unrealistic expectations, and you want to not be spending your time either trying to meet those expectations or trying to talk them up into a more reasonable budget or expectations. Often, though, people are looking for something really, really specific. 3 projects from the last couple of months. One was a novel set in Western Canada in a Cree community. They were looking for an editor with a Cree background. There is one in the association. One that I know, one that we were able to find in the association. Another one was set in Laos, and there were a lot of references to Laotian culture, and we needed someone who was really familiar with Laos. Ended up hiring someone in Laos to do the work. The market has become totally international. Similarly, we had one come in last week that was essays on Bangladeshi politics. And that one needed someone who knows the politics and could speak and edit both languages. So again, that one's going back to South Asia. But the more specific knowledge you have and the more you can let people know you have specific knowledge, the more likely those oddball projects will land on your lap. I had the weird coincidence of editing 3 consecutive books on cannibalism. There was a major cannibalism trial in Hamilton 20-something years ago. 3 publishers put on books on the case, and I ended up with all 3 books. So for years now, I've had cannibalism as a subject specialty. And it's amazing how much that stupid entry has brought in the number of, and some people just call up with jokes, you know, oh, you do cannibalism. Do you do cookbooks as well? Well, yes, actually I do. So anything like that that you can do to make yourself distinctive when people are looking, anything that can catch their attention is worth doing. How long it takes to get established. I started in September 1977. Got bits and pieces of weird work. Got some work at the university I was living at. Ended up doing some inventory work at the Nissan place across the street. Anything for money because I was the one paying the rent. I wrote articles for the Globe and Mail and for the Star, and you know, it was anything for money. Was advertising myself as a writer editor, and over the next year, 1978, I landed a couple of regular gigs and started to get established. Still wasn't billing very much. By January 1979, so 16 months later, I was working full-time and busy. And that's a pretty typical path. It takes a year to a year and a half from absolutely no work. I had literally just moved to town to established enough that you can stop panicking about work and just focus on getting it done. Okay, so any questions on the introductory stuff?
Yeah, we do have a couple. One's actually more for me than for you, and that one of our attendees asks if this webinar will be sent to us via email. And the answer is yes, you will get an email probably within the next day with a link to a recording of this email, a copy of Greg's slides, and an evaluation form. And also, Allison asks, was that company, the partners, were they book publishers? That's in reference to the gig that led to the work for Ontario Hydro and Four Seasons.
No, they were simply a design company. I had no idea what they designed. And the thing they had me work on that day was Ontario Hydro's annual report, the first one they had done, and they just wanted an extra set of eyes to make sure it was clean. But the only reason for knocking on their door was they were literally across the street.
Well, sometimes that's what you need. So a couple other questions have come up just as we've been talking. Marcus asks, where do you get editorial training currently?
I teach at George Brown. I used to teach at Ryerson. There's still Centennial College, and there's Humber in Toronto. Outside of Toronto, there's actually a list on the Editors Canada website of the various training programs in the country. Simon Fraser is probably the best known and most widely respected, although I think Ryerson's is about as good. There's one at Queen's, there are a batch in Quebec. And many of them now are online. George Brown's entire program is online this semester and probably next. Ryerson has had an online component for years. So there's a lot of it out there.
Okay, and we also have a couple questions about software. Judith asks, what are some practical ways you can keep up with software?
Talk to other editors. We'll get to it. We talk about software and complain about new versions and discover new functions and so on, and talk about it a lot on Facebook and on Twitter, or even in meetings.
Okay, and finally, Barb asks, also on the subject of software, what software do you use the most right now?
I run a company, so my editing, I still use Word. I'm mostly just using Google Sheets because it's easy to use. I'm doing estimates and schedules and all that sort of stuff. I use QuickBooks for invoicing. Most editing is done in Word. Google Docs has added a whole batch of editing functions over the last year, and you can actually edit. It now has track changes and comments and the functions you need. It's not as good, but it's free. But it can't do things. You end up exporting to Word for it to be formatted properly and so on anyway. So you pretty much can't get around Word.
Okay, that's all the questions at the moment. So we can continue. Any questions that get asked while I'm speaking are going to have to wait for the next break in the presentation, I'm afraid.
Okay. So when I was asked to give this session, I was sent a list of questions to answer. So let's get into them. What about Editors Canada's online directory of entries? What sorts of experience can I include in my entry when I don't have much or any professional experience? And what should I focus on in terms of skills? So the last webinar like this I did was 4 years ago, and it was on that topic. And rather than give the same webinar again, I'm simply going to send you to the Getting Work with the Online Directory of Editors webinar. It's mostly still up to date. It's 4 years old, but the directory itself hasn't changed, and most of the things I said there still apply. So it's on YouTube. I don't see the link there, but I'm sure we can send you a link if you need.
I think it may be in the next slide, at least.
It could be the next slide. Okay, so I found this, which is the second association directory. I couldn't get the first one because it's in my copy is in the Editors Canada office, and I can't get into the office for some reason. But this was what my directory entry looked like when I had 1 year's experience. So I'm showing you this so you can see how I managed to stretch not very much experience into something that at least looks reasonably credible. At that point, I had worked on some books for Coles Publishing, the publisher that found me through the student newspaper, and I'd edited reports for the university itself. So the media I'd worked in were books and reports. The previous draft, I think, had thesis on it because I'd edited my own thesis. That was probably stretching it a little. My skills, I reached back here. I had been doing volunteer editing for my 4 years in university. I worked on the student newspaper. I worked on Vancouver's equivalent of Now Magazine. And none of it was paid, but all of it was good experience. So the editor and proofreader experience, editorial skills here, is legitimate. I did it for 4 years, but it was all volunteer. Um, the general trade fiction and nonfiction was what I was doing for the book publisher. Academic was what I was doing for the university. The university also had me abstract journal articles, so I was an abstractor. There were my skills. And it's all literally true. It's much of it is a bit of a stretch. You know, I have skill as a general trade fiction editor, but I've only been doing it for a couple of months. Editorial experience. Automotive repair is funny in there. My very first book was a how to repair your moped book. So that gets in there as automotive repair. These are basically the subjects of the first half dozen books I did. I presumably did 2 hockey books because it says sports, especially hockey. The academic is the social sciences stuff I was doing for the university. So again, stretching a pretty thin amount of editorial experience into a relatively credible listing. Interests in education. I've always loved science fiction, so that goes there. I've been a stamp collector for all my life. That goes in there. I was married to an actress, so that goes in there. We talked about theater all the time. I accidentally learned an awful lot about it, so why not? MA in political science, probably the least practical degree you can get. Specializing in Canadian politics. I've done 1 Canadian politics book in 43 years. What I should have focused on here is statistics. The fact that I took master's level statistics has opened an incredible number of doors, because on anything academic or political or whatever, if there are problems in the statistics, I'm trained to see them. That is an incredibly sellable skill. And if I could talk to Greg 40 years ago, I would say, really play up the stats. That's going to open a lot of doors for you. And public administration, academic training, that opened the door to quite a number of government jobs. A lot of government editing is done freelance or short contracts. The combination of politics, stats, and public administration let me into those doors. Whatever your training is will let you into specialized places like that. And training, editing training plus specialized academic training should, in theory, open doors for you that won't open for other people. I spent 4 years as an FM radio disc jockey. So expert in contemporary music and record collecting. The record collecting came because the music magazines I used to edit would pay me in records because they didn't actually have any cash. The fact that I knew contemporary music is why I was able to get writing gigs at the Globe and Mail and the Star. Because I had writing gigs at the Globe and Mail and the Star, I was suddenly credible. I'm working for places people have actually heard of, and they may have even read something I wrote. So that gives me credibility when I'm starting to talk to people in other places. There are 2 basic ways to take your career. You can be a specialist or you can be a generalist. I've always been a complete generalist. I bore really, really easily. And as much as possible, I try and get work that doesn't resemble anything I've done before. So that is great in that it keeps you entertained. It lets you edit a whole lot of things possibly more shallowly than the specialist would. I work with a number of medical editors, and that is what they do. That is all they do. And in some cases, they only do specific kinds of medicine, which lets them become extremely expert in that field and utterly unable to edit anything else that comes in. And that's a personality thing. And you're going to discover which you're comfortable with as you start working. Diplomatic but fastidious. You got to say something, eh? And the next one's funny. Have never missed a deadline. I had at that point had so few deadlines that I was fanatical about meeting them, and You know, when you've only ever had 6 deadlines, having met them all is not quite the achievement it sounds like. But the next sentence, I already have defined the niche that's kept me happy for 40 something years. I like nothing better than the challenge of an oddball project. Knowing that about myself so early in the piece has let me focus or not focus. It's left me open to unexpected, weird opportunities that other people would just run screaming from. Okay, so one of the things I talk about in the other webinar is SEO, search engine optimization. And what I've learned last time is that the SEO presentation I give in there is entirely focused on optimizing for Google. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the other webinar and then you will know what I'm talking about. I talk in there about various ways of having your name come up as right at the top of the list when you search on Google. What I've discovered since then is that other search engines optimize differently. I've been playing with DuckDuckGoose, trying to optimize myself there. And on DuckDuckGoose, I discovered this. Art Masterclass with me. Except it's not me. It's some guy in Britain who's taken my name. Ioannou is Greek for Johnson. There are actually an awful lot of Greg Ioannou out there. And until now, the only one that I shared search engines with was some guy in Sydney who kept getting arrested for stealing kitchens from houses that were being built. This guy is in London teaching art classes. And on search engines like DuckDuckGoose and Bing, which are worldwide, he outranks me, and it has me considerably rankled. I'm still all over, because Google is local, I'm the best known Greg Ioannou in Toronto, so I come up all over the rankings. So when you're doing SEO, don't just focus on the one search engine. One of my goals for the next 6 months or a year is to get this guy knocked way down to the bottom of the rankings. And probably likewise. Questions on any of that stuff?
Well, we do have one question, and also one, not so much a question as a comment, and that Robin Laren, who I think has some sort of volunteer position, I forget what, with us, says that she has to slip out, but looks forward to the recording and thanks you for what there has been of the presentation thus far. And in terms of actual questions, Christy says, is that other webinar where SEO is discussed the same webinar that the link was on the slide a few minutes back?
Yes, it's the second half of that webinar. The first half is really about the directory, how it works and how to make the best use of it. And then the second half of it is your directory and entry and the outside world, how Google sees your entry and so on.
Okay, so follow-up question that Elizabeth asks, could you please put the link back up or in chat so you can go back a couple pages, show the link if you want, or I can extract it. Oh, okay,
there.
So there's the link. I think we can ask Caitlin, who'll be distributing the like the recording and the slides and everything, to sort of include this link and any other links people are interested in her email, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, so
there's one other link that comes up that you're going to want.
Okay, and we do have another actual question. Again, actually, we have two other questions because one just popped up. First, Christy once again asks, do you find that new editors need to depend on social media or SEO a lot? And how important is LinkedIn? And actually related to this, as it just came up, Becky also asks, what are your recommendations for finding work on social media?
I get to that. I've got several slides on it. We'll get to all of that.
So I'll leave these questions floating for the time being. And Josephine also asks, were you questioned by potential employers' clients about your early entry on Editors Canada, i.e. were they satisfied with your limited experience at that time, even though you had stretched it?
Yes, because I knew how to do the work. I had just the one book publishing gig, and I'd only had it for a few months, but it was pretty intense. And something else that comes up, the production manager there would take me aside every Friday and point out every mistake I'd made the previous week, which was incredibly valuable. No one expects you to be perfect. The good employers will do that kind of coaching so you at least get to make new mistakes. From the other side of the desk, very often you've got a task you need done and you simply want someone to do it. And if the person seems credible and, comes across as knowing what the work entails and how to do it, you're happy to get it off your desk and focus on the next problem. So there are two needs being filled here. There's someone who has work that they need to get someone to do, and there's someone else looking for work, and you're trying to make that connection. It was even more striking when I went from doing freelance writing to doing freelance editing for magazines. We were desperate for writers. We would hop on any new writing material that came in, looking for writers who could actually write. We were sick of writers where we had to rewrite it 4 times to get something publishable. And none of the writers out there seem to realize that there's a whole market there really, really hungry for what I'm capable of producing. The thing that sells is competence. When you do that first project well, in a lot of cases, you'll get an infinite supply of repeat work. And it's the same with editors. Okay. Are there ways you can stand out from the crowd? The more you get to expose yourself, the more you'll stand out from the crowd. At this moment, you're sort of a massive, 60-something would-be editors at a webinar. I have no way of distinguishing any of you from any others. It's difficult, atypical times. We're not going to meet in person anytime soon. But the more you can make a good impression, either online or in person or somewhere, making a good impression means seeming intelligent, seeming pleasant, seeming like someone you would want to work with. It's weirdly kind of like dating. You don't want to start a conversation with a would-be client by ranting about your previous clients, just like you don't want to rant about your previous dates. You're trying to show what you can do, and ideally you're trying to show that you're willing to start by doing whatever is out there that needs doing. You're not going to edit Margaret Atwood on your first gig, probably. You're going to edit. If you had called my office anytime in the past several months, you would have been assigned some work on our nightmare project. Everyone in the office had already worked on it. We wanted nothing to do with it. And you call and say, do you have any editing or proofreading that he's doing? If you call on the right day, you would get a happy yes, let us send it to you. The day afterwards, you would find out why we had been so happy to get it off our desks. But it was there. It gets your foot in the door. Try and keep in mind the needs of the person on the other side of the conversation. Fairly often, they're either where I am at the moment, everything's sort of under control. I'm trying to catch up on emails I should have answered 3 weeks ago and so on, or I'm trying to find someone who can do something that my staff can't handle. And you want to try and be that someone. One way I tell people to do that is, if you're sending me your resume, put the content of the resume into the body of the email. That way, when I search for Cree, I pull up the one editor who has it in her resume. When I search for Bangladesh. It, you know, you want to be the person who the search filter catches. And often if that material is in an attachment, it's not going to come up. Whereas if it's in the body of the text of the email, it will. Weird things like my thing with cannibalism. Yeah, I'm not a cannibalism. It really doesn't appeal to me. But because I've sort of weirdly got subject expertise in the matter, people want to talk about it. They're interested in it. It opens unexpected doors. So, do I need to have a business name yet? Probably yes. And search engines will tell you that. If you search for yourself and nothing much comes up, you have to do some search engine optimization, but also you may want a distinctive business name which will be easier to make distinctive. I know 2 editors named Kathy van der Linden. I tell them apart by one lives in BC and one lives in Mississauga. I know 2 editors named Mike Jones, less surprisingly. One's in Arizona, one's in Calgary. Those names are going to be almost impossible to make distinctive. So particularly if you have a somewhat generic name, you want a non-generic business name that will catch people's attention. You do have to search that no one else is already using it, but you have to do that anyway because you want a business name that no one else is using. It should be relatively credible. When I wanted a business name, I called my lawyer and she said, well, there's 2 ways to name a business that aren't going to cost you a whole lot of fees. Name the company after yourself or name the company after the street you're on. I didn't particularly want to use my own name because I'm sort of, you get tired of people mispronouncing it always and they misspell it and so on. I was on Coburn Street. Coburn sounded credible enough. So the company became Coburn Communications. No need to pay for registration, no need for any of that stuff. Actually, I did have to register it as a business, but I didn't have to do a title search or any of that kind of stuff because it was the street I was on. So that is an easy solution. I would say for most people, yeah, you probably do want a name, unless you have a really distinctive name yourself that just simply isn't going to get confused. Okay, and the last one of that batch of questions. Do I need to have a website? Yes, yet. I think so. The website does a couple of things. One, it gives you somewhere to send, when someone finds you on Google, it gives you somewhere to send them. But also it gives you credibility. Is it well written? Is it cleanly edited? It doesn't have to be much. I have friends who have 2 or 3 or 4 page websites that are just all they need. You say what you do, you say what you work on, you give a little bit of bio, and you get a way for them to contact you. It's cheap, it's distinctive. So yeah. Questions on that chunk?
Yeah, we do have one question. Renee asks, where/how can I register a business name?
Depends what province you're in. Just Google business registration and your province name, and they will tell you. A more relevant question is, do you want to just be a sole proprietor or do you want to incorporate? And be a sole proprietor for as long as you possibly can. Incorporation can cost quite a bit of money, And filing corporate taxes, just going through the paperwork, will cost you about $2,500 a year. And you don't want to have that hassle and that expense until you're saving at least $2,500 in taxes through having done it. There was a question I didn't think to put in the list. Other questions?
Not exactly. We did have a question about whether you need a website, but then it was withdrawn once you answered it on your own.
Okay.
Wait, sorry, one just popped up. Any comment? Well, I know some of this is going to come up, but Patrick asks, any comments on one, volunteering, and two, blogging? I know some of that at least is coming up later in the presentation, I believe.
Yeah, volunteering comes up almost immediately. I think it's the next slide. Blogging I don't get into. The more your name is on the net, the more easy you're going to be to find, the more credible you are to the search engines, so the higher they push you up the rankings. If you blog and you use your real name or your business name, yeah, it's definitely worth doing. But again, it's writing samples. The blog pieces have to be really well written, really tightly edited, and if you really dig, you can find things I posted online in the 1990s. If you really, really dig, you can find things I wrote for the student newspaper in the 1970s. Anything you blog is going to be up there forever. So you've really got to keep that in mind. Not only if you say something stupid, you're not saying something stupid now, you're saying something stupid for the entire rest of your life. So yeah, be original, be entertaining, but be professional, because it will bite you.
Okay, I did have one other question just pop up. Sandra asks, two other questions, another one just popped up as I was talking. First, Sandra asks, is it necessary to carry insurance such as E&O as an editor?
Oh, good question. Okay. That doesn't mean the other questions were bad questions. It means, oh, I didn't think of that. Not until you're forced to. You're probably working from home. It doesn't, and if you're having customers come to your home in more normal times, if you're having author meetings and so on, you probably need your insurance company to know that. It's probably not going to even cost you anything extra to get, visitor insurance added, or really basic business insurance. Errors and omissions insurance becomes relevant when you're doing corporate stuff, when you're doing some government contracts, and usually it becomes an issue when you land a government contract that requires it, at which point you probably have the cash flow to pay for it anyway. I do have it. I've needed it twice in my career and probably should have had it earlier because there have been misadventures. In one case, one of my staff made a mistake when proofreading and transposed the name of a murder victim and the murderer. And the murder victim's family wasn't entirely amused. Another case, again proofreading, someone in the office missed a typo on page 18 of a corporate book, corporate fat brochure thing. Probably no one would have noticed, but they insisted on reprinting and came at me for the $18,000 reprint costs. In a third case, a project went completely sideways. The work was rejected by the client, and everyone who had anything to do with it was sued. And even though my involvement consisted basically of file management, I found myself in small claims court anyway. It's handy to have. And particularly, I have a batch of staff. I do a lot of work. We're working on 46 books at the moment. And things occasionally will go sideways. Nobody's perfect. It's good to have, when you get to that level, you want that kind of backup. But I've always tried to make sure that I have some contract that requires it and is paying enough to cover the cost of it. The Editors Association used to offer it. The person at the insurance company who was running it left, and it's been left kind of orphaned. There is a committee at the moment looking into getting both health insurance and errors and omissions insurance available to members. As far as I know, that committee is looking for volunteers. So if it's something you really care about, it's something you can help move along more quickly if you put some volunteer energy into it.
Okay, do still have a couple more questions, though we're
Sure.
probably going to have to move on fairly soon, since I think we're starting to run late at this point. Brigitte asks, what is the attitude, I don't know if that means your attitude or people's attitude in general, to changing language to modernization as well as to remaining strict on grammar?
Part of your responsibility as an editor is to keep current with language, which, whether you're strict on grammar or use current language on any particular document, is the client's call. But you need to be flexible enough to understand both ways of doing it and see what's appropriate for the document you're working on and the client you're working with. I won't hire editors who are really rigid one way or the other. I need flexibility. So if you come in and you're a grammatical stickler, that's pretty much the end of the conversation. If you come in and you have no time for traditional grammatical rules, whatever, that rules you out of a different batch of projects. So as an editor, you should really be comfortable working in any variant of the language that you're likely to have to work in.
Okay, so we still have at this point 4 live questions still waiting to be answered.
Let me get to the next batch of questions, because
okay.
I probably cover some of them. Also, my setup here doesn't have a clock. So other than the sun coming through the window,
we're about 5 minutes to 11. So we're or 5 minutes
so we're going
to
back in
2
time.
p.m. 5 minutes to 2 p.m. Sorry, I'm in BC. So
that's cool. Yeah. Okay. So the other webpage I want to send you to is on the Editors Canada website. It's called the Career Builder. And I'm going to go through the relevant section fairly quickly. This thing was written and debated over the last couple of years, basically for the people taking this webinar. You're exactly the target audience. So what do you focus on as you start and over the first 3 or 4 years of your career? So I'm going to go through the stuff that's in year 1 of the Career Builder. Okay. So an awful lot of the work that you will get will be passed to you from other editors. Normally, when a project comes in and I know I'm not the right person, the answer will be, call Stephanie, she does that. Or, call Fred, I heard he was hungry and looking for work, or whatever. You try not to say no. You try to say, I can't do it, but this other person whose work I trust can. Because you're basically building up favors. Stephanie's going to remember that you gave her some overflow work, and next time she has some, she'll try and pass some back, and so on. I had one of those come in about 20 minutes before this session started. And it was kind of cool because I had something for him. He had a project that he couldn't meet the timeline, and I had a project where I didn't have all the resources I needed, and so we've simply traded projects. It happens a lot. So you want to meet as many editors as you can, preferably in person, but it's going to be online these days. Learn as much as you can about the profession. The professional editorial standards are also on the website. Search for Standards 2016. Study the hell out of them. These didn't exist. Well, they did exist, but they were only provided, editorial standards only were provided to Stanford students when I was starting. And we passed around photocopies of the Stanford standards. Now these ones are much more refined. They reflect how editing is done in Canada. And it's really interesting as someone hiring editors that the parts of the standards that are really well spelled out in Editors Canada, I find Canadian editors are better at doing that kind of work. So there's a section on stylistic editing. British and American editors tend not to have any training in stylistic editing, don't know what it means. And when you start talking about the tasks in stylistic editing, they say, oh yeah, I do some of that stuff in line editing, but it's not really focused the way stylistic editing is. So simply getting your head around the standards and the logic of them will help frame your education, and you'll start to realize where the gaps in your education are. You'll also start to realize that some of the work in some of the standards really appeals to you, and other parts of it make you run screaming. I am a substantive and stylistic editor. I've copy edited for years. I'm not good at it. I've occasionally proofread, but only if I'm sort of the only emergency proofreader available. I'm really good at the early parts of the process. And you get to know that about yourself by learning as much as you can about the profession. So do what networking you can. If there are local meetings, go to them. Join the editing Facebook groups. Editors Association of Earth is the logical place to start. There are a whole batch of other editors groups that link from that. If you're a member of the Editors Canada, join the Editors Canada group, join the Editors Canada student group. There's a separate editorial community on Twitter, and it doesn't take a whole lot of venturing around to find out which hashtags they're using. I'm not a Twitter person, so I follow a couple of the basic ones occasionally. But there's an entire separate editorial community on Twitter. Follow some editing blogs, volunteer with your local association. Volunteering gives you the advantage of showing that you're competent and pleasant to work with. There's been a volunteer helping with these webinars, and I've been intentionally trying to send work her way, just as an appreciation thing, but also I know she knows what she's doing now. I've got a really good feel of her skills. And also working with her as a volunteer, I know when she's looking for work and when she's not. There's an Association Editors Canada email forum. There's also the Copy Editors List, CEL, which is old but still functional and has the advantage is it has a lot of the really experienced editors on it. And of course, join an editing association. You get discounts and things. You get access to job boards. You get into their business directory and so on. This is an Editors Canada webinar, so you know which one I sort of lean towards, but they all offer an awful lot. I can't imagine being an editor, particularly a freelance editor, and not being part of an association. Over 40 years, about half of my work has come through the association one way or the other. People I've met in the association, from the directory, and so on. It's just, and an awful lot of other resources, and just, it's nice having friends in the biz. Part 2 is less relevant than at the moment than it usually is. Go to conferences. I always go to the Editors Canada conference. There used to be an annual editing conference in Rochester that I went to a lot. There's a Conferences for Editors Facebook group that lists them all and so on. Of course, there aren't live conferences at the moment. The next Editors Canada conference is probably going to be virtual. It's just too risky to book the space and incur the cost to to reserve a live venue. It's going to be virtual conferences for the next year or two. at this point, you're trying to learn anyway, so you'll get a lot from the conference session. Eventually, it becomes the main networking event of the year. It's the place where you touch base with old friends and meet new people and hear of opportunities. If you specialize in a particular subject area, pay attention to conferences and associations in that subject area. So I've edited fantasy and science fiction. I sometimes go to Ad Astra. I sometimes go to, there's another one whose name I'm blanking on in Ottawa. You know, hang out with the people in your subject area. You know, there are medical writers associations and so on and so on. Take courses if you're feeling weak. The first ones to take are the grounding ones, punctuation, grammar, style. You also need to take the editing basics. So structural, substantive editing, stylistic editing, copy editing, and proofreading. The key combination is punctuation, grammar, and copy editing. They're really the core skills. But you need to be trained in all of it because you're not going to be sure until you've done it where your skill set actually fits. No point being a really good substantive editor and training as a copy editor and never having taken substantive. You wouldn't discover where your strength is. But you need a thorough grounding. You also need to get trained in tools, you know, how Word actually works, how to write queries, when to write queries, how to phrase them, and so on. The editing programs teach you this stuff. We have webinars on most of it. There's a free Editor's Candidate webinar on the professional standards and how to apply them. You know, you've got to learn what editing is and how to do it. You also have to learn how to use the tools. Okay. Editing, particularly freelance editing, is a business, and we've got separate webinars on how to do freelance editing. We've got a separate one on estimating. I've already mentioned the one, the free webinar on finding work with the online directory. Treat it as a business. At least at first, you're going to be spending at least half your time trying to find work, so you become a salesperson. When you get to the point of having to do estimates and so on, take the estimating webinar. It seems daunting. It's actually relatively easy to estimate editorial projects. You're probably going to fairly wildly underestimate at first, but so be it. That's a learning experience too. But it's a skill. It's an easy to learn skill. Take the training. Okay. The second step in the career builder is find out what you're good at and not good at. And to me, at least as importantly, find out what you enjoy doing. If you're going to be doing this for a long time, you want it to be fun. This, 43 years in, my job is still a blast. I'm, you know, mostly working on books. I get to work on a different one every day or two because I'm doing the very first steps of evaluating what needs to be done on them and so on. It's like getting paid to hang out at a library and read whatever I feel like or read a different book each day. It's still a lot of fun. And do this right and you will get a career that's lucrative and entertaining. Do it wrongly and you'll burn out after 3 or 4 years, or you'll never get to that point of being 16 months in and having a steady flow of work. Okay, more questions?
I do have a number of questions. I should first say it's now 2:07 Toronto time, so I think.
Okay. Actually, let me flip through the tail end of it then.
Oh, okay.
You can just read these slides, I think.
Okay. So save the questions till you're.
Yeah.
Sort of
Okay.
flip
I mean,
the rest of this then.
There's my answer on how to handle interviews. Yeah. These last slides, I've asked questions and basically put the answer on the next slide. So one thing I haven't talked about is mentors. Pretty much everyone I know who's been a successful editor has had one or more mentors. I've had three. One of them, Lee Donjou, helped form the association with me, and we worked together until she retired in the 90s. Lawrence Haskett was one of my very first clients. He had me editing dictionaries and textbooks at Collier Macmillan, and every time I took some work in, he would go over it with me and teach me things, and it was just fabulous hands-on editing training. Don Sedgwick at Doubleday also used to send me a lot of really fun stuff, and the conversations with Don were always about the mechanisms of the publishing industry, things like how they estimated the editing time it would take, how they scheduled, how they developed the schedules, and so on. So each of them taught me a different part of the field that was essential. And at this point, Lawrence died years ago. Lee and Don are both retired, but they were always there for years and years as resources if I had questions. It was wonderful to have them to fall back on. Okay, questions?
Okay, so we do have a couple other questions. I don't know if you want to cover any of the HST or business cards.
No, I'm going to skip right past them because I luckily put the answers into the next slide, so you don't.
Okay.
So you know those questions are there, and you don't have to ask them.
So there's any questions you sent into Greg in advance that he has not answered in detail, then the answers are written out also in detail in the slides. So we have first one, Christina asks, which committee was it that you mentioned was looking for new members, thing to do with like health insurance and...
The insurance task force.
Insurance task force. So that's your answer, Christina.
Email info@editors, ask for the contact information on the insurance task force, and she'll put you in touch with the right person.
Okay. We also had a question about suggestions for giving estimates, which of course you already talked about a bit. And that is actually posted in chat. So one of our other attendees, Becky, actually posted the link to the webinar for estimating editorial costs, which is definitely highly recommended. I believe that's one of that I had the honor of hosting that. So I can definitely say that Greg did a really phenomenal job with a lot of extremely useful information in that. So there's a plug.
Thank you.
And we also have another question, I guess more for me than for you, is will this webinar be posted at Editors Canada? I got my time zone wrong. It is free, so first of all, you will be getting, if you're registered for it, then I believe you'll be getting a copy of the recording by email within the next day. And since it is a free webinar, I'm guessing maybe it'll end up being posted on YouTube as well.
It'll be posted on YouTube. I believe there's a process. You know, they edit out the really embarrassing things I said. They edit out all the times I scratched my nose.
Very nice for them. So, okay, I do have a few other questions. So first of all, just related to the question about social media earlier, how important is LinkedIn?
Some people I know really swear by it. I've made one really good contact at LinkedIn with a publishing professional in Pennsylvania. It's about 10 years ago. 10 years later, we still trade work constantly. We do different kinds of stuff. You know, it was worth all my involvement in LinkedIn just for that. I find the site itself really tedious. There is a planned making the best of LinkedIn webinar on the schedule for next year, although it's still tentative.
Okay, so a couple other questions. How important do you think it is to have a contract signed with doing smaller editorial projects at the very early stage of your career?
Probably not. Editors Canada has a standard editorial agreement. It's important to read through and see the sorts of questions that get asked. Just so you need to know what sorts of questions to be asking the client. I don't usually sign a contract under $5,000. Other people have it, the limit is $1,000 or $2,000. You don't want to go through the time it takes to negotiate the contract for, you know, a 4-hour job. It's going to take you 4 hours to do the paperwork.
Okay, we do have another question, like more for me than for you, and it's that Elizabeth asks where the estimate link is. Becky Noel posted that in the chat window, which is Looks like a sort of icon that looks like a sort of cartoon speech bubble. You can click on that. You have permanent chat shows up, including a link about in the middle of the page. You should also get a copy of the chat saved to your Zoom folder once this is done, so you can look that up at your leisure. And of course, you can just go to the Editors Canada webinar website, which is training.editors.ca, and search for it there. So finally, we have several questions from Julia Kim. First, she asks, what sort of web hosting sites or programs would you recommend for an editing website?
I hate them all. I
Okay.
don't have any I recommend. um, I, I don't have an intelligent answer to that.
Okay. So next question. Okay, sorry. Next question. Do you recommend Editors Canada's John Erick's Madrano mentorship program?
It works if you're really specifically trying to get mentorship in something. If you're trying to get mentorship in something specific, you saw in my discussion of the three mentors I had, they were go-to people for specific kinds of questions. They had specific kinds of expertise, and all three of them knew all of that to some extent. But if I had a publishing specific question, I would go to Don. And the mentorship program is really good if you're focused like that. If you need help with everything, it's probably not going to be as much help as you would want.
Okay, and finally, oh, actually getting a bit more activity in the chat, and it looks like the link was originally posted to all panelists rather than to all attendees, but now it has been posted to all attendees. So everyone who was wondering about that estimating editorial costs webinar should now be able to see it in the chat. And I apologize, as a panelist, I didn't realize that it was only visible to us and not to attendees, but it is visible now for everyone. So hopefully that'll be of use. And finally, Julie also asks, how important is certification?
Sort of, as a beginner, you're trying to establish your credibility, and it proves that you know what you're doing. It does open doors to some government gigs. I think more importantly, it gives you self-confidence. You know, someone really knowledgeable and fussy out there has told you you know what you're doing. Particularly if you're going after government or corporate work, I think it's quite important. It's very hard to get certified. Okay, one last suggestion before we close. When I was starting out, I gave myself a ground rule. If I was looking for work, every afternoon I would identify 3 people or places I would approach and research them, and the following morning I would make those 3 phone calls. And it worked really well to focus me and discipline myself. 3 isn't a daunting number of phone calls. 3 isn't a daunting amount of research. And about once a week, those 15 calls in a week would generate some sort of new work. And it was really nice when I hit the point where I didn't have to do it anymore, which came fairly early in the piece. But just everyone hates making cold calls. Everyone hates trying to approach would-be customers or employers. And just making it systematized like that really helped me a lot.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we don't seem to have any more questions. Plus, I believe it's now 2:17 by my watch. So I'm afraid
Okay.
Greg's going to have to rush out the door very quickly, from what I
Right.
understand. So I'd like to thank Greg for an excellent presentation. I'd like to thank all our attendees for attending and for their very incisive and helpful questions. And again, I'd just like to very quickly remind everyone that you will receive an evaluation by email within the next day, as well as a copy of this recording and a copy of Greg's slides. Plus, this recording will be available down the line on YouTube. So do please take a moment to fill out those evaluations when you receive them, as again, they're very useful for the improvement of the program. So we have a lot of people thanking you and Editors Canada in general for the webinar and for all your suggestions. So I'd like to once again thank everyone for attending, and we'll be ending the webinar shortly. And again, I'm sure if you do have any further questions in future, then I'm sure Greg would be happy to answer them by email. I know that
Sure. I live on Facebook and
yeah,
in,
or
in
by
all the
Facebook.
editors groups there. So asking questions on Facebook gets me quicker than anything. My staff reach me by sending me messages on Facebook.
Oh, I had no idea. Okay, so thank you once again, everyone. Fred, I'm not going to take the several minutes necessary to pass on all of the individual thank yous from the
Okay.
attendees,
Thank you
given
all
that
for
we're already
attending.
running a bit late.
I hope
Thank
to meet
you
you in
once again,
person.
everyone. And hope everyone has a nice day and has good luck with their editing career going forward.
And thank you for
Thank
hosting
you.
so well. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.